Good to be with you tonight. Hope that you're doing well. Hope that your week's been good thus far. I know that I feel like I've had a really good week. And it started out with a good time spent worshiping with all of you on Sunday morning. It's continued with a great Bible study last night, again with some of you who are here. And it's on weeks like this one that I'm just so thankful for what God has given us in community, in His church. He's put us here not on our own, but with each other. And the way that we're able to build each other up is just really remarkable. Really something that I feel this week God has truly provided for us. And I'm more aware of that this week because of all of you. So I thank all of you for all that you do. And I hope that all of you feel that same way. I want to begin tonight with a word written by David in that same psalm, Psalm 59, that was read just a moment ago. Starting in verse 1. Deliver me from my enemies, O my God. Protect me from those who rise up against me. Deliver me from those who work evil, and save me from bloodthirsty men. For behold, they lie in wait for my life. Fierce men stir up strife against me. For no transgression or sin of mine, O Lord, for no fault of mine, they run and make ready. Awake, come to me and see. You, Lord God of hosts, are God of Israel. Rouse yourself to punish all the nations. Spare none of those who treacherously plot evil. Each evening they come back, howling like dogs and prowling about the city. They are there, bellowing with their mouths and with swords in their lips, for who, they think, will hear us? But you, O Lord, you laugh at them. You hold all the nations in derision. O my strength, I will watch for you, O God, are my fortress. My God and His steadfast love will meet me. God will let me look on in triumph on my enemies. When I was young, we would go and visit my grandparents. They lived in a small town of Mammoth Spring, Arkansas. Now, that's what we like to call in Arkansas the country. It's out in the country. Now, I don't see too much of the country around here in this place that we live, but maybe you've been to the country before. I'm told by several of our older members that this place that I stand right now used to be the country, but I haven't been here long enough to see it that way. Regardless, my grandparents lived out in the country. They didn't have many neighbors, just a few houses scattered around. But I remember one of those houses across the street and down the way a little bit. I can't say it was right across the street. Nothing was right across the street. It was down the way a little bit. One of those houses was one that we didn't visit very often. The man that lived there was nice enough older man. He was a good friend of my grandfather's. But when we went around, he didn't have very much to say to me and my younger brother. And so it was one of those houses that we just kind of avoided. We didn't feel like we should go there. Now, it wasn't until that I was older that my dad explained to me why Mr. David Manus, that was his name, was so distant when I saw him, why he didn't have so much to say to me. Mr. David had fought in World War II, and he had some memories from that he didn't really like, but he couldn't really get away from, he couldn't forget. And on occasion, not if you ask him, but on occasion with people that were friends like my grandfather, he would tell some of those stories. And because he told my grandfather told my dad, and my dad has now since shared some of those with me. The story that I find the most interesting, though, is one that's somewhat recognizable. It's the one that stands out to me. It's the story when Mr. David was at Bastogne. Now, you may remember that story. The Battle of the Bulge, right, was the last attempt of the German forces to break through the Allied forces' line. Before they were turned back by Allied forces, the Germans surrounded the city of Bastogne, trapping the American forces who had been forced to retreat into that city. They cut off all 7 of the highways that went in and out of that city on December 21st. And Mr. David spent that night in that city knowing that even though he couldn't see them, enemies were all around him. That winter was one of the worst ones in recent memory, they say. And the ground was so cold that Mr. David told my grandfather they could not dig trenches to hide in. That's how frozen the ground was. And so they waited. And the next day, the German commander sent a letter ordering a peaceful surrender of the troops that were in that city. Now, this is the part of the story that you might remember if you've ever heard this story before. The American commander sent back his response, and it wasn't what the Germans expected. Does anyone know what he sent back? It was just one word. He sent back the word nuts in all capital letters with an exclamation point. And Mr. David told that story to my granddad. Now, of course, the Germans took that about the way that you would expect them to. And the next day, Mr. David endured as that city was shot at by tanks all day long. And the next day, the same happened. And the next day, the same. And even on Christmas Day, again, they were under siege. But on December 26th, help came from beyond the view from within the walls of Bastogne. General George Patton had turned his army around, and he was able to break through that barricade, that encirclement of German forces. He secured a corridor by which help would surely come to those men in that city. Now, Mr. David told my grandfather that the men inside of Bastogne, the men that were besieged, did the best that they could, but they knew that they were trapped and they couldn't get out. They knew that they could not save themselves. They were outnumbered 5-1. And they had hoped that there would be someone who would come. They knew that there would be someone who was trying to get there in time. But they just couldn't know that anybody would make it before they couldn't hold their position anymore. And he talked about what it meant, after days of being besieged, to see familiar faces come past those walls and let them know that they were being saved. That the distant hope that they had of being saved was becoming a reality for them that day. Mr. David, in that way, is not so different than the son of David, the son of Jesse, David, that I think we've been studying the last few weeks, is he? After all, as we read in the psalm that we began with tonight, David knew what it was to be surrounded by his enemies. Our story tonight comes from 1 Samuel chapter 19, if you'd like to be turning there. And it actually comes between some of the stories that Stephen talked about last week, so some of it might sound familiar to you. Saul had become fed up with David, who was quite the wonder boy in Israel. Jonathan was able to stall his anger once, but Saul had just thrown down the gauntlet in the shape of his spear towards David. With that image of Saul's spear lodged into his brain, David flees to his house, the last place that he can be safe for just a little while. But it's not going to be for long. You see, when David fled to his house, Saul sent men to watch him. He sent men to guard that house. This was going to be David's last stand. David wasn't going to be able to escape. Saul was going to finish what he started back in the palace. David was trapped. And it's fitting that the psalm that we began with tonight was written within the very walls that David is trapped behind. If you read the little caption at the beginning of Psalm 59, it was written during this event when Saul sent his men to guard David's house. That's what the heading tells us, at least. And David finds himself surrounded. And he knows that he has no tricks left. He has no way to escape on his own. But even here, we find that David's not alone. He does, after all, have a wife who happens to be the daughter of Saul. And Michal is with him. Not only is she with him, but she has a plan for him to escape. The text tells us in verse 11 that Saul sent messengers to David's house to watch him, that he might kill him in the morning. But Michal, David's wife, told him, "If you do not escape with your life tonight, tomorrow you will be killed." So Michal let David down through the window, and he fled away, and he escaped. And Michal took an image, and she laid it on the bed, and put a pillow of goat's hair at its head, and covered it with his clothes. And when Saul sent messengers to take David, she said, "Well, he's sick." So Saul sent the messengers to see David, saying, "Bring him up to me in the bed, that I may kill him. I don't mind that he's sick, I'll kill him anyway." And when the messengers came in, behold, the image was in the bed with the pillow of goat's hair at its head. And Saul said to Michal, "Why have you deceived me thus, and let my enemy go, so that he's escaped?" And Michal answered Saul, "He said to me, 'Let me go. Why should I kill you?'" Now, there are several questions that you and I might have as we read this story. First, does it seem to you that all of David's allies are Saul's children? Last week it was Jonathan who helped David escape. This week it's Michal. We have to ask the question, is Saul just that unlikable? Is he that bad of a guy? Is David just that likable? Is he such an awesome guy that even all of Saul's children are turning against him? And you know that this isn't an easy sell for Michal. Saul may accept her reason for why she let David go, that her life was in danger, but you can't believe that Saul bought that fully. Saul knows that Michal loves David. That's why he gives her to him as a wife. His hope was that she would be David's undoing, and yet now here she's been the one who's helped him escape. Another question we might have in this text is, why is there an image in the house of David? Image, or maybe some of your translations read idol. And I'm just going to be honest with you, that's a really hard question. I don't know why there is an image in David's house, but the text isn't too concerned with it. The text doesn't seem to be too worried about it here. So the next question, the more important one there is, how is it that this image that Michael puts at the top, a pillow of goat's hair, look like a man that was described to us just a couple chapters ago as handsome and ruddy? How do they think that this is David here? You know that David doesn't look like that. I imagine that Saul's henchmen took some flack over this one. Not only did they let David escape by night out of the window, but they also believed that they were about to pull the covers back on David when they find someone who doesn't look quite like David there. Whatever the case, the story is pretty straightforward, I think, for us. David's in trouble. He's surrounded by his enemies, but his wife, Michal, helps him to escape from her father, Saul. And David lives to fight another day. But David's on the run now. He's not going to know where he's going to put his head every night. And so he retreats. He goes to Samuel, that prophet who anointed him to be the next king over Israel. And I imagine that David would like to talk with Samuel about how that's working out for him, but he doesn't really get time, because as soon as David escapes from those who are seeking to kill him, the chase ensues. It tells us, as we continue in the text now, David fled and escaped, and he came to Samuel at Ramah and told him all that Saul had done to him. And he and Samuel went and lived in Naioth. And it was told Saul, behold, David is at Naioth in Ramah. So David has run away with Samuel to live in Naioth, but Saul learns of this, and he plans to finish what he started. He's going to get David this time. Then Saul sent messengers to take David, and when they saw the company of the prophets prophesying, and Samuel standing his head over them, the Spirit of God came upon the messengers of Saul, and they also prophesied. And when it was told Saul, he sent other messengers, and they also prophesied. And Saul sent messengers again a third time, and they also prophesied. Now, isn't this a strange story? I want you to know that I didn't draw the short straw when Stephen and I were picking out what stories we wanted to preach on in this series together. I chose these stories, and I know that they're strange, but I think that they show us how David is being helped along as he flees from Saul tonight. Saul sends men to take David, but they are stopped by a case of impromptu prophecy when they see Samuel and the prophets. Now, Saul can't believe this, so it says that he sends another group, and the same happens to them. What were they prophesying about? I can't tell you, but I know this: they didn't take David back to Saul. So Saul sends a third bunch of men with the same results. And finally, Saul gets the idea, if you're going to do something, you got to do it yourself. If you want it done right, take care of it. So Saul goes, and it goes about like we would expect for him. It says, then Saul went to Ramah and came to the great well that is in Seku. And he asked, where are Samuel and David? And one said, behold, they are in Naioth and Ramah. And he went there to Naioth and Ramah, and the Spirit of God came upon him also. And as he went, he prophesied until he came to that place. Saul comes to David to take him away. And the Spirit takes him to Samuel, where he prophesies day and night. That's what the text will go on to say. Now, whatever Saul intends to do to David is going to have to wait until the Spirit of God finishes its work here, right? David is going to be saved. He's going to be taken care of. But David is not done running. The text tells us in chapter 20 that David flees and he goes to Jonathan. He asks Jonathan, why is your father chasing me? Jonathan doesn't know anything about it. So Jonathan goes and he talks to Saul. And after speaking with his father, Jonathan is convinced of the same thing as David, that David must flee because Saul will not rest until he is dead. So David runs. David's going to run everywhere. He runs to Israel. He runs to Moab. He runs to Philistia. He runs to caves. He runs to cities. He runs to priests. He runs to kings. David's going to go everywhere. And we're going to look at some of those stories in the next few weeks, but I want to circle back to this psalm that we began with tonight, because I think that we have to have the context for what David's on-the-run lifestyle is about, what that's like. We need to see how David runs and where he runs. and what he's running after together tonight before we can continue. When David finds himself trapped, pinned in behind the walls, he knows that he cannot escape on his own. He needs help. And in this story, he finds it. Whether it's Jonathan or Michael or Samuel, David constantly receives aid when he finds himself surrounded by those who mean to do him harm. And yet, this psalm isn't addressed to any of those people, is it? It's not addressed to David, or it's not addressed to Michael or to Samuel, even though it would be good to thank your wife for saving you. And it would be good to thank Samuel for stopping Saul from killing you. But that's not what it says. What does he say? I will sing of your strength. I will sing aloud of your steadfast love in the morning. For you have been to me a fortress and a refuge in my day of distress. O my strength, I will sing praises to you. For you, O God, you are my fortress, the God who shows me steadfast love. When David feels trapped, surrounded on all sides, he does not look to those who are trapped with him for his deliverance. He looks beyond the walls that enclose him for a familiar face to rescue him. He calls out to God, "Deliver me from my enemies, O my God. Protect me from those who rise up against me." David is very aware of the fact that he cannot get himself out of trouble. He knows that he needs help of the one who anointed him to open up a way. And it's not like David is hiding. Just because David is trapped does not mean that he is hiding. There's an interesting theme in David's psalm where David claims his innocence and casts light upon those who seek him harm. David proclaims boldly to God that he has done no wrong, and yet these people seek to harm him. But he talks about his enemies as dogs who prowl about the city. And what does he say about them? Why do they do this? What are they saying to themselves? Who will hear us? Nobody's going to hear us. They think that they can do what they want, that they can commit evil against the anointed one of God because they won't be heard. But David laughs at this. God laughs at this. Who can hide from God? David knows that God is his fortress. He does not need physical walls to withstand the forces that plot against him. God will let him look on those, as he's prayed in this psalm, who would do him harm in triumph. David is relying on God. He's confident in God. And it's in this way that he runs. David will spend so much of his time on the run. And the question that we may need to ask is why? Why, if God continuously delivers him, and we've seen that he does, is it that David finds himself on the run still? It's because of the way that David is running. Now, I think that I've told you all before, I think I've said this in a sermon, that one time I tried to run away from home whenever I was young and I was in trouble. That didn't last very long. I got about a block up the street before I gave up, and my dad came and picked me up and brought me home. We're not talking about that kind of running here with David. He's not avoiding trouble. And these stories about David are not like the story that we have of Jonah in the Bible. You may recall that story. David is not running away from what God wants him to do or who God wants him to be. If anything, David is doing the opposite of that here. What we see in David is someone who is not running away, but someone who is running towards something. Someone who is chasing after something. And that's not to say that David does not need to run. If David stays in his house that night, Michael's right, he will die. If David ignores Jonathan's advice and he stays, then Saul will kill him. But David's not running away from Saul. He's running towards God. He's chasing God's heart. Now, how can we look at David's story and come to that conclusion? It sounds like maybe a good thing to read in a self-help book, Colby, but is that really what's happening here? And I think that it is. I think that wholeheartedly we can see this story of David's life on the run is less a story of him running away, and it's more about him running to God. David finds himself trapped in life, but he finds himself that way because he is following the call that God has given to him. David is the anointed one of God, and that has led David to fight Israel's enemies, that has led him to serve Israel's king, and now that's led him to flee, to run away from home. He cannot break through the enemies that surround him. The only way that he has to go is the way that God has given him to go, the route that God has cleared by which he can escape. And this time, in this case, today, it's running to Samuel. After that, it's running to Jonathan. And we notice that running to Jonathan does not take David farther away from his problems. If anything, running to Jonathan brings him in closer proximity to Saul. But that is where God's help is coming from, and that's the way that David's going to run. When David escapes, he escapes to the place that God is leading him to fulfill the purpose that God has given him. He does not run away, he runs God's way. He runs the way of escape by God. David's running the way that God gives him to run. David does not treat this escape as a chance to live life the way that he wants. He continues to live the life that God has called him to live. David does not treat this as a chance to escape. We see that a couple chapters over from our story tonight. We see that in chapter 22 of 1 Samuel, that there's a certain group of people that are coming to David while he's on the run. The text tells us everyone who was in distress, everyone who was in debt, everyone who was bitter in soul. These people were the ones that while David was running gathered to him, and he became the commander over them. Who is it that is gathering around David on the run? It's those in trouble. It's those in need. It's those who had lost faith. David's running is not away from what God has called him to be. He's running the direction that God has set him to run. He's running toward God. You remember the man that I talked about earlier tonight, Mr. David, my granddad's neighbor? I was looking into the story of Baston for tonight's lesson. I wanted to make sure that I knew exactly what happened because I had the version that was told me and I wanted to make sure that it was correct. And while I was looking at it, I came across something interesting. After being under siege for several days and being rescued by their brothers in arms, many people thought that the men that had been stuck there in Baston would be given relief, that they would be able to come off of the front lines. Having just been through a really hard battle, a really tough few days, that seems reasonable, right? But that's not what happened. The men who had been in that siege went on to recapture the towns that were invaded by the Germans as they made their way towards the city. They ended up pushing the German line back to the same place that it had been weeks before whenever they had first arrived in Baston. Mr. David was not done with his work. He had been delivered, but he still sought to do what was required of him. All of those men did. And in this series, we've been talking about David chasing God's heart. I think that when we look at a psalm like this one, when we look at stories like these, we see a man who's doing just that. David does not see God's deliverance as an excuse to sneak away from the work that God has placed before him. He does not see his salvation as a means by which he can just ignore his calling. David presses on because he has faith that no matter where his journey takes him, he will always find a fortress, a hope in the living God. His protection is not in the form of walls or mountains or caves. His help is not just a friend, a mentor, or a spouse. They are surely there for him. They surely help him in his time of need. But his rock, his fortress, is his God. And because of that, he can go wherever God sends him with the knowledge that he will be delivered. He has the hope to bring all those who need hope, the downtrodden, the poor, the disenfranchised, together with him, even as he runs from Saul. David's calling as God's anointed requires him to chase God's heart wherever he must go and however he must get there. So that's David, the one who God delivers in so many ways that only he can. That's David's attitude in trusting of the Lord to deliver him from those things that ensnare him. But what about us? Are we running away from the things in life that seem scary or hard, too costly? Are we running the way that God sets before us in his salvation and his deliverance? Or are we using God's deliverance as a way to run back to those things that we feel keep us safe in life? David's life will never be the same after he runs away from Saul. We'll see that in his story. And it might well be that if we follow this path that God has set before us, that we will never be able to go back to the way that things were before. Are we running away, or are we chasing God's heart? Now, maybe chasing God's heart, running towards God, leads us away from the people that we know are pulling us back into the trap that God has released us from. Maybe it leads us to a new job where we aren't as comfortable with our surroundings or the people who we deal with. Maybe it leads us to a new place, a new city, a new town, or maybe even a new phase of life that is more comfortable or maybe less comfortable for us. We say, maybe I can just stay inside the house, surrounded by all these things that are around me, by all these people that I know, instead of going out and finding the help that comes from behind the lines, the help that comes from beyond what we can see. I can't say what may be keeping any of us here tonight from chasing God's heart, but I can say that when God delivers His people, He delivers them for a purpose. When God delivers us, it is so that we can run to Him. When He secures a way for our escape, it is one that leads to where He wants us to go. We may not want to go that way. Our escape route may not always be desirable, but with God as our fortress, we can go wherever He may send us. If I feel trapped, I can rest in the confidence that God will make a path for me to walk if I am willing to follow it. God has secured that path for each one of us tonight. Maybe you need to start down that path. Be baptized into Christ and take on His life. Maybe you've been walking down that path and you're just at a place where you can't see the way out of the situation that you're in. You know, God will make a path, but we have to be ready to follow it wherever it may lead. Maybe you see the path before you tonight and you just know it's going to be a difficult one. You see where your life is headed and you know it's going to be hard. We're here to pray with you tonight as we chase after God's heart together. Whatever you may need, whatever the case for you tonight, you can come now as we stand and as we sing.